Welcome to the Underground Strategy Podcast. My name is Max, and today we're joined by an old friend, Des Latham. And if you've been with us for a while, you'll remember him from the Number 788 miniseries, where he hosted a deep dive discussion based on my book Number 788, covering my experience in Swedish Special Forces. That was a hell of a project, and it's great to have him back. Des, how is it going?
I'm doing well, thanks, Max. And Tony, lovely to be back in the gentle discussion that we had previously about military special forces and the tactics and the training. And 788, it was a remarkable, really, introduction to Swedish special forces for me, having known not very much from the southern tip of Africa, obviously. So thank you. Lovely to be here.
It is great to have you here, Des. And last time we worked together on Number 788, but today we are shifting gears to Stalingrad, one of the most brutal battles in history. And I know you run several great podcasts, and one of them covers Stalingrad in depth. You did quite a few episodes on it, right?
I made 43, I think it was. Or was it 22? Sorry, in my mind, I can't remember. It's way back 4 years ago now. 21 episodes, I think it was, and in the space of the time it took for Stalingrad to fall. But I started a little earlier. I started around the early July period of 42, and then ended in February 43, which is when Stalingrad fell. And so I followed it week by week. So it was really a weekly series over those weeks. More likely 43.
Tracking it in real time like that, week by week. It must have been such an intense way to cover it. But what made you focus on Stalingrad? Obviously, it's one of the biggest battles, but what specifically pulled you in?
I think as a veteran myself, and before then just reading about the inhuman, degrading war that took place there, rats and sewers, and also secondly for me, the extreme temperatures from the late 30 degrees centigrade down to minus 30 degrees centigrade. Understanding that, as well as how the whole tactical and strategic element of what went on there, how it all backfired really for the Germans, and the insanity really of Hitler forcing the Sixth Army to remain unmoved as they pushed towards the Caucasus. Just a number of things that came together. And then the reason to start it actually was really the Crimean invasion by Russia. And in 2014, when I interviewed the Russian ambassador here in South Africa as a journalist, and he gave me a long lecture, including in that lecture was stories about, Russian heroism, the Great Patriotic War, as he called it. And I suddenly realized that it's so deeply ingrained in the average Russian psyche now, and thus Ukraine and everything else that's going on. It's then to understand what their sentiment is in terms of their relationship in the center part of Europe with their one arm in the east and the other arm in the west, and the sense of paranoia that pervades that society generally about being invaded, which they've been invaded constantly, including by Sweden, we must hasten to add. I can't remember the year, but 16-something I think it was. So that's the long answer, is to understand contemporary global geopolitics based on understanding of what makes people tick, and then just the pure story of it all, where you find heroism on both sides when soldiers are thrown into a cesspool like that, a frozen one. Both elements, both the Germans and the Russians, their storyline is just immense. How people survive that is really beyond me to this day. I don't really fully understand how they survived it. Those 5,000 Germans that walked out after, 150,000 captured, 5,000 survived the prison camps. 1 million dead on both sides, apparently, at least.
That is grim numbers. And, while Stalingrad might feel like a relic of the past, we've seen the same kind of same kind of brutal urban warfare again and again. We can look at Grozny, Fallujah, Aleppo, Azovstal. The way the defenders hold out street by street under relentless bombardment and all of that. It's not so different from the standoffs at the tractor factory and the Red October factory in Stalingrad. A different time, different war, but the same brutal reality. Haunting indeed.
Des, it's so good to have you back with us. As Max was saying, just for our listeners, I'll mention one other thing, that when we were starting to get our podcast started, and we're still early days, Des was one of our mentors, teaching us, showing us the ropes and so on. So it's a great pleasure to have him back now as a guest. And as you know, he did the number 788 mini-series with Max, which was really well received. So great having you with us, Des.
Tony, thank you.
I want to go straight, take a couple of steps back and just ask about, if you can just take us back to that German advance on Moscow, and just a little bit in broad strokes about what was happening that time.
Well, its Army Group Center had been pushing forward since the invasion in June, and they'd been held up in a number of defenses, and also there were some extreme disasters. I mean, for example, when they approached Smolensk, which Napoleon approached, as we all know, 100 whatever it was years before, 180. It's one of the oldest Russian areas inside Russia, and a killing field, traditionally. And that's when the grimness of the attack and counterattack really started, which became part of the culture of the German-Russian conflict. So the Germans, of course, got held up, as did the French. And but the unspoken reality was the great skedaddle which took place as the Germans approached in July 41. They approached the Russian capital. There was food rationing, which started on about the 15th. On the 1st of July, there was food. By the 15th, there was no food. So it was really, really quick. The speed at which the Germans approached terrified the Russians. And we tend to forget just how fast this blitzkrieg was. They're going 30 miles, 60 kilometers a day on average. So it didn't take them long to get from even the distance of the steppe to get to close enough to Moscow. And the Great Skedaddle was a number of the intellectuals and the connected Communist Party members in Moscow fled by car, mainly, away without permission from Stalin. And a lot of them were shot later for doing this. And they were eventually turned back. And that change in terms of not one step back from Stalin, who'd said that at Moscow, because Stalin didn't leave. He'd been caught out, and for 2 weeks he said nothing to the Russian people after the Stalin invasion. It took 14 days before he actually said anything. But from then on, he imbued the nation with kind of nationalist sentiment, the patriotic thing. And so it was that point where he made the statements about not one step back, which he used repeatedly after that. And ironically, so did Hitler, when Hitler realized what he was doing. So you had these two powerful men, all starting from this initial failure to take Moscow for the Germans, as they approached from, the west, from Smolensk area. And some of the initial decisions by Zhukov, for example, was lambasted later for his decision to, for instance, Kiev. I think the Russians lost 200,000 men encircled there in one day, 1.5 days. And, for Zhukov, that was a disaster. So Zhukov was deploying the same thing as Stalin, which was he refused to allow his army to retreat at that point. So you have a number of these moments, I think, that for me, looking at that invasion by the Army Group Center, that some of the culture, if you like, of what the officer class was going to do later was stiffened at that point.
So the Germans have failed to take Moscow, and basically one of their first real setbacks after an otherwise highly successful blitzkrieg campaign. Now their focus shifts south towards the Caucasus oil fields, but instead of keeping that momentum going, they get drawn into Stalingrad. And why is that? The Sixth Army didn't have to get bogged down there. They could have bypassed the city, secured the oil, and, kept pushing on. So why did everything grind to a halt in Stalingrad?
This is a really interesting point. Stalingrad is named after Stalin, for a start. And Stalin fought at Petrograd, which is what Stalingrad became. During the Civil War, he was a commander there. And so he kind of had a feeling for that area. And for Hitler, it became this thing of defeating the city with the name of his evil opponent in his mind. So you've got to start from there. Strategically and tactically, the Sixth Army and others in charge were warning Hitler about doing this because he deviated to the north to take Stalingrad. Instead of just crossing the Volga and continuing on his merry way to take the oil in the Caucasus and the Stans, as they're now known, instead of doing that, he became fixated with defeating this relatively small army left inside Stalingrad. Instead of just encircling it and leaving them to rot, he decided the full frontal attack was required. And of course, it gobbled up a huge number of troops and of material. Nearly 2,000 planes, for example, were involved for a couple of days bombing, especially in August of 42. I think 23rd of August was the biggest ever bombing campaign in the entire Eastern Front up to then. And that was in Stalingrad. Over 40,000 civilians died on that one day. So, it became a thing where he had to prove his point to the officers. And at the HK, for the Hitler's HQ, there was tension growing with his officers, as we all know. And he began to impose himself on strategic decisions from then on and became more and more kind of involved, if you like, on that. But, Rokossovsky, for me, as one of the generals, just to deviate for a second, he was involved in Moscow, and then he was redeployed with Zhukov down to Stalingrad by the end of the year, when the Germans began, they were almost surrounded by them. And for me, I know that we've had a chat offline about the heroes for the Russians, but Rokossovsky is one of the clear heroes as a military person. And his personal story is remarkable too. It's extraordinary, actually. He was thrown in 1937. He was one of the purged officers. He was of Polish royal extraction. He was thrown into prison. He was mock executed twice. They dragged him out of his cell at night, put him on his knees, put something over his head, and going to shoot him in the back of the head twice. His wife and child were treated abysmally. And then suddenly Stalin has a change of mind when the Germans invade and pulls him out of the gulag and puts him back into senior officer commanding. He ends up commanding the overturn of the Germans at Stalingrad, basically, him and the other leaders of the time. But Rokossovsky was one of those who was really instrumental in tactically in outwitting the Germans. So you have those intersection between the politics of the time in Russia and the I suppose you call them the patriots, the true patriots, who, despite what he'd gone through, what Stalin had put him through personally, he was back as a general and doing his thing. So that's one of the remarkable side stories, I think, to Stalingrad for me, is those kind of tales.
I just wanted to pick up on what you said about the other commanders, because it's an interesting discussion. We have talked about this a bit offline, and obviously one of the most well-known Russian commanders is Zhukov, no question. He had the strategic vision, massive presence, and he played a crucial role in Moscow, Kursk, and later Berlin. But personally, I think Vasilevsky doesn't get enough credit when it comes to Stalingrad. He was the quiet, methodical strategist, handling logistics, coordination, and the front-wide deployments. And he did that in a way that was absolutely key to the encirclement of the Sixth Army. And the way he managed the Don Front and the Southwestern Front simultaneously was basically, or in my opinion, a masterclass in operational planning. And unlike Zhukov, he had this direct line to Stalin from the front. And that tells you something about how highly he was regarded, because Stalin wasn't exactly an easy man to work with. And Zhukov's role at the high strategical level it's undeniable. But for the actual execution of Stalingrad's encirclement, I'd put my money on Vasilevsky every time. All right, quick checkpoint. If you're finding value in this episode, leave us a review on your app. It really makes a difference. Watching on YouTube, hit that subscribe button to stay sharp. Now back to it.
Sorry, let's jump in here. The operations that they launched in the latter phases of the surrounding of the Sixth Army was Vasilevsky and the Russian commanders had figured out by then the major weakness inside the Germans' operations. And obviously it was material and access to logistics, but more than that, they understood how to use the winter against the Germans. And their troops were much better prepared by then. So being able to strike in multiple ways and combine the Air Force, the Russian Air Force, with artillery, which the Russians really had battled with in the first kind of months of the war. In fact, the first year, over a year, the coordination between elements of the units was virtually, at times, was zero. Mainly because of ego, but there were other problems with the Russian system. They had an old-fashioned, they didn't have radios, for example, and that really had an effect on the way in which they communicated. But as you say, Max, people like Vasilevsky and others were quick learners. Rokossovsky is another example of that. And Chokov himself. He was a bit of a thug, Chokov. He's a brawling barroom bandit, basically. He's one of these tough, square-jawed, no-neck soldiers. And so he wasn't kind of liked by the academics of that period. You're right. I mean, Stalin treated him poorly at times. I mean, he dragged him back from Manchuria, where he'd helped in the Japanese conflict. He'd led some of the major battles there. And he began to double guess Zhukov in the run-up to Moscow. But, I always think of the leadership of that period. They never knew when they were going to be shot or survive or be fired or be sent to the front line themselves. A lot was going on behind the scenes. And I think people like Choikov managed to break the hold of the commissars, because by Stalingrad, there were the commissars behind the lines shooting soldiers who retreated, but they'd lost a lot of their edge. Up to that period, they'd been leading a lot of the tactical decisions. Now, you had non-military people making decisions for their soldiers based on the fact that they were political deployees. And by Stalingrad, their power was gone. They were still informing the HKVD and whatnot, but they weren't as effective. They weren't allowed to command any longer.
That is a good point, and that shift from political oversight to real military command, it was crucial. And with commissars losing their authority, officers could then finally make those tactical decisions without any ideological interference, so to say. And you can really see the evolution in Soviet doctrine at this stage. If we go back early into the war, their ability to maneuver large forces effectively, well, it was a major weakness. But by Stalingrad, they had adapted. And coordinating large-scale offensives across multiple fronts in a way that had been nearly impossible before. So yeah, I agree. Reducing the role of the commissars definitely played a vital role in that shift.
So it's interesting about the commissars, because I think it plays out a certain way in the war, but then afterwards, when Khrushchev becomes president, I mean, you have to fact check me if it was president or prime minister, in that time. And then I think he lets Vasilevsky go again, so he gets the final word. So you know what it's like between the political and the military elites. There was some intricate interplay over there. But I'm in agreement with with everything that was said. And I want to go back for a second to this discussion about this blitzkrieg, this rapid lightning war. And it's always kind of this fast moving, you catch people by surprise, you catch them, you disorient them, however you want to say it. But a lot of the myth around this blitzkrieg was like, yeah, but if we actually stand and fight, then it's going to be one person against the next, or one force against the next force, platoon, division, army, company, whatever. And I think Stalingrad really proves this, Des. And I don't know if you can give us a little bit about the fighting, right? Because it's pretty brutal. It's hand to hand, it's close quarters combat, it's urban warfare, it's a siege of sorts. There's a lot to unpack over there, but just any thoughts that you have around when it comes down to the actual brutality of that fight?
Well, I mean, the Germans invaded with more horses than machines, for a start. The German army, it's a myth that they were mechanized. They were marching, like Napoleon's army. They marched in. I mean, the initial blitzkrieg into France was the majority of Germans marched in. They weren't on mechanized machines. So it's a bit of a myth that they, had this total mechanized army. They did not. The same thing on the Eastern Front. The vast majority of men marched in and marched out. They didn't take vehicles. So because of that, you can imagine marching 60 kilometers a day, carrying 40, 50 kilograms, or less, depending on, which situation you're in. And the step is never ending. And the stories of what the Germans experienced day in, day out. It was dust and it was flat. And they couldn't see the end. There was no end to it. And when they did come across small hovels and houses, they all looked the same. And the majority of people did not greet them. And some places in Ukraine, in Western Ukraine, for example, they did greet them friendly. And in other places in Russia, they were greeted with friendly, open arms to some extent, because the purges that Stalin had been indulging in for so many years had turned most of the peasant class against him. But that changed pretty rapidly with the SS, who were following these marching troops. So there was this sense that they were actually marching non-stop. And so by the time they marched all the way to Stalingrad, these troops were, even though they'd been rotated out, were pretty mentally exhausted. And on top of that fact, and even with the new regiments that were brought in later, they had, they worked on smell. One of the things that we know as soldiers, how visceral the sense of smell is in combat. It's much more visceral than any other senses. And they used to smell each other inside the frozen basements of Stalingrad. That's how they smelt. That's how they gauged how close people were. They didn't hear as much as smell. When they could smell certain things, they knew that their opponent was nearby.
I mean, that's such a crazy detail. That is so, when you put it like that, and one just imagines, because I've never had that, right? I know what you mean about the sense of smell. It's often for me what triggers nostalgia or some sort of distant thought, or maybe a bunker or something very, not as intense as that. And I don't know if Max, you have any thoughts, but I'm just thinking how absolutely nuts that must have been for that to be the sense, one of your senses that gauges friendly forces or distance and so on.
The smell is indeed a powerful sense in combat. There is no doubt about that. And I've never experienced it in the way they did in Stalingrad, of course, where you literally identifying friend from foe by scent. But it makes sense. It makes perfect sense. And in battle, smells hit you harder than almost anything. Gunpowder, blood, sweat, the mud, sometimes even the distinct dampness of a place, or in the desert, that dry, almost metallic scent in the air. But to be at the point where your primary way of sensing an enemy is through smell, I mean, that's just another level. And after months in Stalingrad, in those conditions, I can't even imagine what that must have been like.
The new arrivals from the German side had very little time to live when they arrived, and the veterans knew, when to move, when to stand up, and as we all do in combat, eventually you figure it out, but they didn't have time. So everything was compressed to such an extent that, room by room was being fought for. So this went on for months, basically. So you'd have an attack of the Russians into a part of near the tank factory, take a room, and then the return would drive them out of that room. Then the Russians would come back the next night. The Russians were much better than the Germans at fighting at night, and night fighting is critical in military combat. If you don't control the nights, you're kind of done. Although these days with our scopes, it's changed a bit, and with the drones. But in those days, controlling the night was the most satisfactory thing for troops to do in terms of hand-to-hand combat capacity. So there were specialist units on the Russian side who fought at night specifically, and were obviously after 6 or 8 weeks of fighting, were highly proficient at taking the Germans out in rooms. And those stories were told quite a bit after the war, to some extent, by the veterans. But I think, the thing that the sense of sniping capacity at that time was extraordinary, really. And it was taking place in the same way that sniping takes place now, but the difference there was it's similar to Ukraine. I mean, Max, you brought it up. It's similar from what I can see to Ukraine. So you have the shattered landscape in which someone is planting themselves, waiting for movement. And one of the ironies for me is the best snipers of Stalingrad were women. One in a book written in the 80s, which won the Nobel Prize, called The Unwomanly Face of War by Svetlana Alexievich. In 85, she won the Nobel for interviewing women. There were 800,000 women soldiers fighting for Russia during the Second World War. It's 3% of the entire army. They were very good at sniping, because it was even more existential in terms of life or death for them. And perhaps it's a gender thing, I'm not sure, but many would describe, especially in early spring, they'd lie in the rain, and then they would freeze onto the ground from the rain. It would freeze them in place, and they couldn't move. They'd just be literally frozen at a part on the front line. But there are a number of snipers who made their names. I mean, there's Kokinya, her name, if I pronounce it incorrectly in Russian, I apologize. So that scared the living daylights out of the Germans. They had never fought women before. And it reminds me a little bit of ISIS, Islamic State. Nothing scares them more than being killed by a woman. And the Russians became aware of this and started using women in a more of a combat role. I mean, for example, around Moscow, by the time the Germans arrived in the outskirts, all of the anti-aircraft gunners were women. It's a little known fact. And after the war, the Russians tried to suppress that knowledge. This is very embarrassing, telling people that you use your woman in war, especially if you're such a macho state as the nationalists in Russia. I mean, there are many things that really broke up the concepts of what gender does in war. And when you're on your back's against the wall and you're being raped and murdered, nothing makes you aim as sharply as that if you're a woman, I reckon.
Absolutely. And with the Soviets, you can argue it was either progress or just necessity. I mean, they didn't have the luxury of sidelining capable soldiers at this point. But at the same time, they clearly saw the value of using women in combat. And what's interesting is that even after the war, they weren't particularly resistant to keeping women in the certain military roles. While at the same time, in many Western armies, we still struggle with that integration today. But beyond just filling the ranks, there is, of course, also a psychological aspect on the battlefield. We have seen similar dynamics in modern conflicts, like in Israel, where female soldiers are integrated into combat roles. Even if they operate in their own units, their presence still influences the battlefield and morale, both for their own side and for the enemy. And as you mentioned, with ISIS, cultural and ideological factors make that effect even stronger in certain conflicts.
Yeah. I mean, the other great unit which has been movies made about it were the Night Witches. They flew these biplanes, and what they used to do, and they were few basically airplanes that were obsolete at night. And Stalin was approached by one of the pilots, women pilots, Raskova, who said that she wanted to start an all-women unit so that they weren't, predated on by men. They could run their own show, and Stalin said, sure. And they were really fearful in Stalingrad itself. They were known as the Night Witches because they used to switch the engines off. And so the Germans would hear the planes, like we hear drones these days, I guess. And then the engine would go quiet. And then the last minute, what they'd hear is the whistling sound of the wind going through the biplane spars. And then they knew that they were close. The bomb would probably be coming close. So you get those kind of visceral tales of the combination of things. And of course, a number of women were captured when they crashed and were found dead in their planes and so on. So the Germans had built up a big sense of myth around women pilots, where, they were given a lot more power than they really had. But they were, of course, scary because they flew these old planes that looked like bats in the sky and were silent when they committed. When they dropped their bombs, they were actually, the engines were off. And that was really scary to people lying in a trench somewhere.
But isn't that just a terrifying maneuver in itself, Des? I mean, you're a pilot. Shutting off your engine in an old biplane at night over enemy lines, that's got to be an incredibly risky move.
Well, I presume what they meant is that they pulled the power back and they came in on idle. But apparently they did actually switch these things off, because you can start it quite easily once you push the mix back in. Because, they'll be gliding at maybe 120 knots, which is like 250 k's an hour. And then all you got to do is give the engine a little bit of juice, and the prop is spinning around like crazy. It's going to start itself, it's like getting into a car and putting in second gear and then letting it go down the side of a mountain. It's going to start by the time you take your foot off the clutch, you're pretty sure. So, yes. And of course, if it didn't start, they were gliding. So they would level out and start the engine the traditional way. But of course, I would never have done this. I must be quite honest about it. There's just no way. At night, no lights, going towards something you can't see, with people shooting at you, because they don't know where you are, but they're definitely shooting at you. And your engine is off. I don't think so.
Oh, man. And I love this whole discussion about the role of women in war. as if it's actually a thing, like to say, a man could squeeze the trigger better than a woman. It's like there's a battle going on around this machismo, right? And you know what I'm trying to say? As you mentioned, how people try to suppress it after the fact. But in the moment, industrial war by its nature, it takes away that kind of ancient idea of the knight, the single person in combat. It takes it away, right? Because it's just masses and masses. And funny how something as elementary as it's a human being, whether they, a man or a woman, makes a difference. And it's interesting how this becomes this big discussion. It's like it's a war fought afterwards, right? A narrative war, a kind of machismo, feminism stuff.
Precisely. When the Germans rocked up in September outside Stalingrad, the men, women, and children dug anti-tank defenses 3 miles deep, 60 miles long in 1 week. They worked 24 hours a day non-stop because around the corner was the 6th Army coming towards them. So, if you have two people and each of them is carrying a semi-automatic or an automatic, you want two people versus the one person coming at you with the automatic. So arming half of your population kind of makes no sense to me if you in one of these final scenarios we're talking about. You arm 1.5 because the rest of them are kids and grannies and grandpas. But the women of the right age, you definitely give them a firearm and say, right, off you go, because we have an army of 1.5 million, not 1 million. Makes no sense not giving them firearms.
Certainly, and it ties in with this idea how modern weaponry has changed this idea of, at least what's in the West, the idea of chivalry and combat from the Middle Ages, where it would take a very long time to teach a knight to fight, to teach someone to use the long bow, the crossbow, pikes, whatever weaponry. It would take a considerable amount of time to do that. But with the advent of different types of technology, rifles, automatic, semi-automatic, as you mentioned, suddenly you could give this to a 7-year-old and just squeeze the trigger. It might not be the most effective, but, some lead would go in the right direction.
There were women tank units, T-34 tank units. And T-34s are not very easy to drive. You need quite a lot of power in your arms and legs. So, but I understand from the people who are traditionalists, so-called inverted commas, they have the perception about the world being broken up into a warrior class, the priest class, and the merchant class. And then the men do all this. And, they're very traditionalist when it comes to the monotheistic religions. They base everything based on Middle Eastern, this is what men do and women do. But when you are in a fight to the death like Ukraine or Stalingrad, that's a nicety that is just a luxury. And if you are, I was in the military in 81, 82, and I trained with all sorts of people, including women. They were in our officers' course, doing the same 80-kilometer march. Not many of them made it, but they made it. The point being that in armed forces, this is another story. I understand we're going off the thing here, but I think Stalingrad proved to me emphatically that it's not about women or men. It's about people who are well trained, who can shoot straight and you have the guts to do it. And that's both man and woman. Giving it to children is another story. but that's the point of this discussion, to say that that's what the Russians did. They did it because they had to do it, and the Israelis do it because they have to do it. Some of the rabbis there don't like it at all, as we know. But tough. Take it. But you're going to try and squeeze the woman's galil out of her hands. Good luck with that.
And I think we're going to see even more of that going forward with the war in Ukraine, shifting the security landscape. Sweden has ramped up military recruitment and conscription, and naturally, more women are being called up. And some are eager, some are hesitant. But that divide isn't just about gender. The same discussion happens among the men too. But what is interesting is that we still have the luxury of debating this, whether women should serve, whether they belong in combat. While in real war, that debate disappears. When survival is on the line, it's not about tradition, ideology, or theory. It's about who can fight, right? And we've already seen that plenty of women want to and can.
I understand the argument about sexual assault on the battlefield. But when your state is under such extreme duress, that you're going to be raped if your enemy comes into your town, or, give me a gun. And that's many women would do that. They go, okay, well, that's it now. But I suppose we're talking about a thing slightly artificially, because the training in Sweden and other countries, it's not really, they're not really fully aware of exactly what's coming towards them yet. So now we still have the luxury of debating whether or not we should. The men debating this, let alone women. Conscientious objection is part of, our friends who are conscientious objectors have the greatest respect, and it's their choice. At least they have the courage of their own convictions. That's nice to know. I can be friendly with someone like that, even though it's not me. It's really important that you're given the choice, I think.
Quick pause. If you're enjoying this episode, why not buy us a beer? It's the best way to keep Underground Strategy sharp and running. Hit undergroundstrategy.com/support to fuel the mission. Cheers to you. Let's get back into it.
And the history speaks to it, right? Like about all these, the Americans have it. I know in Sweden, just from my discussions with Max, some recent books about women operatives and that being put forward. I mean, whether not that one, but whether some of it is propaganda versus what actually happens in the field, we know for sure that there's been great acts of bravery, whether that's the Kurds, the women units, the Kurds you mentioned earlier about ISIS, or whether that the Russians or what's happening in Ukraine. We see lots on social media now. And then there's, even if I can mention in this recent fight that we're having in Goma for South Africa, and that's a whole other podcast by itself, given what's happening there and the challenges. But we've had women casualties, that have been killed, unfortunately, in Saki, and they fought hard, and they get their due. We salute them, RIP. Just to that point that this is now the reality of warfare, and as you were saying, there still is this kind of clash that's happening at the societal level. This kind of ongoing discussion where do women belong, where do men belong, those beyond the binary. And I think it's the one thing for sure is that the facts of the matter state that women warriors, they have been and they will be here to stay.
Well, the ideologies are whatever yours is and mine is and Max's. The ideologies intersects with the realities. And I've been in situations where people I know have not had the luxury of making the decision whether or not they're going to be allowed to fight or what their personal survival ethos is. So when you're in that situation, I think a lot of folks would make their final decision at that moment. So for us in the Western world, largely, these are esoteric discussions and that affected our grandparents mainly. So it's quite hard to imagine. So it becomes an artificial discussion amongst people who take a position based on their religion or their sentiment about genders, whatever it is. So, but I always look at people and think, I gauge them like I guess you do on this call, Max, Tony. I gauge them, look at their eyes, and then I figure out what are you going to do when I need and you need my back, and who in this place is worthy of that, and if it's, I don't care what race or gender it is. If you're worthy and I'm worthy of that, then we have a chance.
I totally hear you on that, and that's just a very human way of looking at it. There's, in a very practical way also, kind of a soldier's fight. I know in Stalingrad there was the siege of, or the fight in the Red October plant or factory, and we were wondering, Max and I were discussing it before, are there some sort of similarities or continuities with that and then what we saw in Ukraine a couple of years back in the Mariupol factory, where we just saw this kind of large structure, industrial complex, and people just going at it, and just really tough resistance from both sides?
There is, because on both examples, there was production taking place at the same time. So it was the tanks were rolling out of the Red October factory as it was being bombed. So one half of it was in ruins, the other half was functioning. They would be bombed the next day. They would fix part of the roof or leave the roof open and just keep churning out the armaments. And that was happening in Mariupol. It wasn't operating the same way, but it was regarded as still functioning until the last couple of weeks. Then the place itself, an area of it's almost post-apocalyptic. When you I can imagine the similarities there, where soldiers are in a place that has a manufacturing ethos, a large manufacturing. You know, the Red October factory had smelters next to it. So they were fighting, and these things are virtually impervious to even the largest bombs. They may split, but you can use them in defensive situations and so on. So the factory itself is so well constructed out of concrete and steel that even bunker bombs did not completely flatten these places. And of course, with Stalingrad, there were no such thing as bunker bombs per se, but they were using 1-ton bombs, and still not destroying the place. And then as it came down, you had these crumpled piles of steel, which is impervious to shrapnel and most high explosive and even armor-piercing rounds. Can't go through 3 or 4 or 5 layers of crumpled steel. They stop after the second or third one. The power is just, it's diminished. And so inside this crumpled mess, which was Mariupol and also the factory, the Red October factory, the steel factory, the fighting got more and more vicious and harsh because the soldiers could defend themselves in the tiniest spaces. From a hand, you could lie. A hand grenade could be tossed at you 2 feet away, and all you do is keep your mouth open so you don't blow your ears. And nothing happened. You weren't even affected by the blast, just the sound. The same thing from what I read about in Mariupol was taking place. And then it gets a narrative of its own. And I think what really made the Russians, especially the Russian nationalists, very angry was the people doing what you and I are doing, which is to equate the two. The nationalists in Russia have a fit if you mention Mariupol. There's no ways that there's a comparison. So we can maybe let other people argue about that. But there's clearly a correlation in the narrative about exactly what happened.
I guess this ended up being more of a crash course on Stalingrad with a few detours along the way. But before we wrap up, we should really talk about how it all ended. We covered so much, but there is still plenty left to look at, like Operation Uranus, the massive Soviet counteroffensive that encircled the Sixth Army and turned the tide of the battle, or a winter storm, the last-ditch German attempt to break the siege and rescue Polish forces. So let's step back for a moment. How exactly did this battle come to a close? Who won, and what was the real cost?
Well, clearly the Russians won, because the Germans lost, 250,000 men and 175,000, some say. And in the end, 5,000, as I said, walked out. About 5 years later, most were allowed to leave Russia and other parts of the USSR that had gone through the Stalingrad nightmare. And so that's clear. And also, Hitler's entire invasion of the Caucasus was reversed by that loss, but he kept throwing more and more soldiers and material into the operation. So by the 7th of January 1943, there was a letter handed over, and the Soviets achieved victory. It was signed by Voronov and I think it was Rokossovsky himself. And General Paulus, surrendered. Paulus is a pathetic figure in many ways, and he's been maligned by Third Reichians since then. But Paulus basically was a clerk. He had very little operational command, and he was thrown into the Sixth Army mainly because he pandered to Hitler. And there were a number of other generals who would have been a lot better, but he just got the job because he just looked the best at the time, typical of the German army at that moment, the officer corps in particular. So, I think he's carried a stick for something he shouldn't really have been there. He surrendered. There were still pockets continuing to fight on of other elements. By the 27th, by the third week of January, it was over. And the actual final surrender was signed in February. So I think it was the 6th or 7th of February. And, we had these visions of a few thousand Stalingraders, civilians emerging, or a few hundred actually, and then a few thousand in total returning back to the city of hundreds of thousands. There were, I think, 5,000 to 6,000 civilians left. So they went back. And something like this could be going on in the future in parts of Ukraine. The Germans Caucasus operation, the army group south fell apart. They were almost surrounded on retreat. The Sebastopol again came into view there. And people say, well, there was the end of the German invasion. Not really. They still had a couple of options, which Hitler blew in Kursk, the Battle of Kursk later, during the retreat. But that's another story. So I think in a nutshell, by early February, the Polish had surrendered. The other elements who were still fighting around the factory, the tractor factory, gave up. And then they were marched out. The terrible scenes as they were marched out is some of the Russian civilians were trying to kill them. They were left there. And others were trying to give them bread because they were quite obviously starving to death. And then the other things the Russians did, which was quite cruel, I thought, is as they marched them through the midwinter steppe, they would just shoot them. So they would march past the units who would just open fire as a joke and see how many they could shoot in a minute, and then their commanders would stop the shooting. So as these pathetic creatures emerged from their rat holes, the Sixth Army, what was left of it, they then, I think some people say their real torture began because of the 100-something thousand. I mean, as I said, there's an argument about exactly how many. 135,000, 175, 5,000 were alive at the end of the Second World War. The rest died. They were killed on the march. They were killed in the prisons. They died in the gulags.
Des, we just want to give you a big word of appreciation and thank you for coming on today, for giving us this wonderful lecture and discussion on Stalingrad. We know that you've had a very successful podcast on Stalingrad, and we'll add a link to that podcast for our listeners. So please do go and see Des's podcast on Stalingrad. If you want more of a deep dive, he goes systematically through the whole conflict. Then also, just to mention that Des had previously led the discussion on Max's number 788 mini-series. And just for information, that's now released in Swedish in audiobook by Vibrary. We'll wait for the soft cover to come out in due course. And then also just to mention that the English book, number 788, was recently shortlisted for a non-fiction military award. So, that's a positive, and sorry for the not so humble brag. And then also while I'm at it, I'm going to mention we're going to do a mini-series on Generals Botha and General Smuts in the First World War, where we'll have Des hosting us again. The logistics and details is being planned. We've got a few trips coming up between the three of us, and we're just going to align our calendars a little bit. And then also to keep an eye out for some future pods with Des on the Anglo-Boer War. He's also an expert on that conflict, as well as the border war, as well as him having served in that particular war. So a big thank you.
My pleasure.
And yes, to echo that, Des, thanks again for coming on. This was a really great discussion. And Stalingrad is one of those battles that never stops offering new insights. Really appreciate you joining us, and to everyone listening, thanks for tuning in. Stay sharp, and we will catch you in the next one. Take care. Bye-bye.
Catch you guys soon.
Thanks so much for having me.